Our guest today is Sidharth Chatterjee, who's leading the United Nations in Kenya. He has worked tirelessly for over 2 decades, spearheading movements related to women empowerment and to the cause of demobilizing soldiers in South Sudan, among many others. It is indeed my privilege and pleasure to welcome him today to Aaj Savere. Many thanks for joining us, Sidharth.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you for welcoming me to this program.
हम अपने दर्शकों को ये बताना चाहेंगे शुरू में कि फोर्ब्स मैगजीन ने आपके ऊपर हाल में एक आर्टिकल लिखा था जिसमें आपको एक पैशनेट लीडर का खिताब दिया गया है जो वुमेन्स कॉज के लिए इतना काम कर रहे हैं. तो आप थोड़ा सा शेयर करें इस आर्टिकल के बारे में.
So Nidhi, at the outset, I think I can proudly call myself a feminist because I really believe.
I love the word.
Yeah,
feminist.
I really believe that as men, we have a responsibility for really advocating for a cause of equality, the cause of equity, the cause of getting rid of.
And equality is very elusive even now.
Indeed,
you would agree.
Indeed. And the most important thing is that no country will ever progress unless its men and women join the workforce. We are looking at India at a looming demographic dividend. The opportunity that India has with an average age of 19 is huge. It can turn itself into, over the next 20, 30 years, into a high-income growth country. But the fact is that can only happen when the 23% of the women that are actually in the labor force turns into 100% in the labor force. When men and women are equal, that is when the household income, the microeconomic picture is going to dramatically change. And that is what will leapfrog the country's economy. But above all that, the contradiction is, here is, as a nation state, we have so many female goddesses, but when it comes to the issues of the rights of women and girls, it's shocking.
यहाँ मैं आपको 1 मिनट के लिए रोकना चाहूंगी सिद्धार्थ जी. आपने अभी ये बताया कि लेबर फोर्स जो आपने बताया 23% है, and the statistics are really alarming. कहा जाता है कि 1990 में ये फिगर्स 47% थी जो अब जाके 23%, 27% ये हो गई हैं. तो अगर हम इतनी वर्कफोर्स को बाहर रखते हैं और उनका कुछ नहीं करते हैं तो मेरे हिसाब से कोई भी नेशन आगे तरक्की नहीं कर सकता, जैसे कि आपने राइटली कहा. मगर क्या ये स्टैटिस्टिक्स जो इंडिया में है जो इतने अलार्मिंग है, मैं अभी आपके साथ कुछ और डेटा शेयर करूंगी, तो क्या ये स्टैटिस्टिक्स केन्या में भी हैं?
There are similar issues. I think there is one thing that is perhaps which covers most of the world is the issues of patriarchy, which our country sees. There are issues of patriarchy in Kenya too. There are issues of misogyny and the whole perspective that a girl child, particularly in India, is seen as a burden. That's why you have very, very high levels of female infanticide which takes place. Now those are things that need to change, but we can't just keep relying on the fact, oh, these are cultural norms. I think you need a three-pronged approach, as I would call it. Prong number 1 is the sensitization, because that change has to happen in the community level. That change has to happen with the father in the home, where he will start to treat his son and daughter equally, and we should not.
Father ka, ek bhai ka.
Exactly. So it must have, that level of equality has to start at the household level. Then we need to sensitize our police forces, our judicial systems. Everything needs to be sensitized on the whole issue of equality. But finally, is the sledgehammer of justice that must be unrelenting in the pursuit of those that violate the rights of women and girls. That India's reputation is marked by the issues of sexual and gender-based violence. That is something that rapidly needs to change.
जैसा कि आपने कहा, हम अपने दर्शकों को ये भी बताना चाहेंगे कि कहीं ना कहीं जो मानसिकता है, जैसे आप कह रहे हैं 3-pronged approach, वो उस मानसिकता को हमें अटैक करना पड़ेगा. इसकी हम बात थोड़ी देर से करते हैं. पहले आप हमें बताइए 41% according to what I have found out is the domestic violence figures in Kenya.
That's right.
Which is nearly half of the Kenyan population. I mean,
That's
going
right.
by -8-9%. So Can you tell us what is happening there?
Well, one good thing about Kenya is that just recently, the president of Kenya, President Uhuru Kenyatta, together with Helen Clark, the UNDP administrator, launched the Africa Human
The one who
Development.
ran for the
Yes, launched
Secretary
launched the Africa Human Development Report. It was a stellar report, and that report is basically on accelerating gender equality and women's empowerment. I mean, for President Kenyatta, the President of Kenya, to himself stand there with the UNDP administrator to launch it is a massive signal that he is a champion. He is a champion of women's rights. His wife, Margaret Kenyatta, another great champion of women's rights, she launched the Beyond Zero campaign. So we have real stars in the political domain who have really taken up the women's issues.
That really
I
helps,
think
yes.
that should echo in my country, India, too. We should see that kind of movement, and it must be a movement which must be collective. It should be a mass action, affirmative action, participated by the highest levels of political authority, talking about our women and girls. Because if we don't change that picture, we will continue to remain poor. Our opportunities at the moment, and by having women as part of the dependents in the workforce, you'll never be able to see the country prosper. If you look at the case of the Asian tigers, look at South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, how did they prosper? It's because the microeconomic picture at the household level changed. The girls were empowered, allowed to be educated, allowed to fulfill their full human potential. In India, high levels of child marriage. In fact, this is the singular country with the highest levels of child marriage in the world. And then the fact that a girl is seen as a dependent, and a burden in a family because a dowry has to be paid every time a girl is to be married is unacceptable. I mean, these are the norms that we have to change. And those changes must happen both at the political level, but most importantly, the policeman cannot be sitting in the bedroom of a household. That's where that change needs to come. So the importance of community elders, the importance of our religious leaders. I think that from the temple to the mosque to the churches, our religious leaders can do enormous amount of
galvanize a lot of change.
Galvanize change. That's where the change will really happen. I hope we can see that kind of change happening because we need a beacon of hope to come from India, where we are seeing a fair amount of fragility in the region. But it is alarming that when India is compared to Somalia or to Afghanistan for on issues of women's rights. Now that is unacceptable for a country which is really, ready to launch spaceships into the moon, and if we have to deal with those issues, that is a challenge. But the picture, the economic picture, it will change dramatically the moment affirmative action is taken, and that affirmative action really boils down to a lot of us men, Indian men, standing up for the rights of women, and I think that's precisely where that change will potentially happen.
I'd like to talk to you about your president's wife now. She's doing a remarkable job furthering the cause of women in Kenya. मगर जो आपने अभी बात कही वो बिल्कुल मैं उससे सहमत हूँ कि भारत में चाइल्ड मैरिज का जो प्रचार है, एक तरह से उन्हें ये भी देखा जाता है कि फ्री लेबर फोर्स मिल रहा है, शादी कर लो, काम करा लो. दूसरी जो मानसिकता यहाँ पे है कि लड़की को पढ़ाओ, ग्रेजुएट बन जाएगी, उसके बाद क्या करना है, शादी करनी है, एंड उसका जो एक्चुअल घर है वो उसका ससुराल है. सो दीज काइंड ऑफ थिंग्स व्हिच हैव बीन इनग्रेन, जिसको हम कहते हैं हमारी कल्चरल सभ्यता, दिस कल्चर नीड्स टू बी इरोडेड एंड very rightly through the minds of boys. I mean, it's not that gender bias is there in India or Kenya.
That's right.
It's there all over the world.
Exactly.
But why are we as a nation not going to, give due priority to this so that our GDP can go up, we can flourish economically, and we can be a superpower.
Exactly.
But isko karne ke liye, aapki jo he for she campaign United Nations will start kiye, that's also very, very commendable. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, the He for She campaign is an important campaign launched by UN Women. The UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, was very much at the forefront of it. And what is interesting is in Kenya, the President of Kenya himself stood at the forefront of launching the He for She campaign. I think that is where those political messages become crucial. So you need the right, I will call it the convergence of 3 Ps, the political will, number one. Number two is the policies. There's no inadequacies in India's policies or in Kenya's policies. It's about ensuring that they are properly implemented. And the third is the partnerships. And I don't think any entity can do it on its own. And that is why the whole issue of faith-based organizations, religious leaders, the civil society organization, all of them have a role to play now in order to start changing those mindsets. And we just cannot say that, culture takes time to change. Sorry, we should be able to leapfrog those changes through the use of technology. So that is why the change that can actually happen at the community level, at the household level, is the change that will stay. But that change also needs the strong arm of justice. People need to know. It has to be like a red light. You violate the rights of a girl, whether in the womb or whether outside the womb, that red light must come on.
Taken to task for that.
Exactly. And of course, then
Put behind bars and very stringent
and
laws.
probably what we need, for example, in Kenya, we have a champion in the president of Kenya. We have a champion in Margaret Kenyatta, his wife, and many others. I think what we need is a
Our
collective.
Prime Minister is doing so much
Right.
for all
So
these.
we need a collective championship. We need championships of chief ministers, governors at the state
Yes,
level,
yes,
down to the district
yes,
level.
yes.
Really, that voice coming out in unison about equality.
मैं
And
समझती
once
हूँ
that,
district level पे सबसे ज़्यादा चाहिए.
right. So, but that you see, you need a role model. You know, after all, you know, Gandhi managed to get an entire movement of young people to start the Dandi March and successfully did the eviction of the British. Exactly. Why can't we have something similar? I think India can serve as a role model for many other parts of the world, and I think Kenya too. I'm proud to be working in that country simply because I can see that there is such a strong will to take that country, and that country is progressing, leapfrogging economically, and they're making all the right efforts in terms of galvanizing those social policy changes to advance human development. So the fact that, you know, when I witnessed the launch of this together by two great leaders and two great champions of women's rights, Helen Clark and the President of Kenya, Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta, I think every UN staff member felt a great deep sense of pride that here is a country that they're serving in, where right from the head of state to the other ministers, the number of ministers in the cabinet, makes a lot of difference. I'm hoping to see that India also sets an example with more and more women in our parliament.
We're taking a short commercial break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and we are in conversation with Mr. Sidharth Chatterjee, who's leading the United Nations in Kenya. Now, coming to your tenure in the UNFPA, and you did a lot of work for peacekeeping missions as well. So can you throw some light and tell us actually peacekeeping hota kya hai?
You see, the UN has a peacekeeping mission where it basically goes to keep the peace. After all, the UN was created around creating, ensuring that there is peace in the world, and that is what brought the UN into existence after the Second World War, and which it continues to do, you know, and continues to do tirelessly in many very difficult parts of the world where UN peacekeeping missions are.
आपने कई जगह serve किया है.
Well, I started my career with a UN peacekeeping mission actually in Sarajevo in Bosnia. I just left the Indian Army, went on to serve in Sarajevo, and I served in other parts of the world too. But I think what is most important is that today there needs to be an external presence in order to help mediate conflicts, and I think that conversation that needs to take place has to happen. There is no better institution but the United Nations, but the United Nations to actually help make those conversations happen. So, you know, whether it's local conflicts, and a lot of them are internecine conflicts, you know, within states. They are not cross-state conflicts, and those are the kind of things that really need an extra effort. I mean, you know, we in India we have our own share of challenges, whether it's in the northeast or in Kashmir. But the issue is that we have to look at ways of resolving these conflicts, because otherwise the flip side of that is it protracts and it goes on and on and on.
And the people suffer.
And people suffer. The economy suffers. The wastage of blood and treasure. I just feel that this is that moment where perhaps the business has to be done very differently, because the hard power is not working. India is a doyen of soft power. It really must shine that beacon of hope in terms of the principles of peace that it can actually bring to bear, and become a model for the rest of the region too.
What about the 25 councils that you're heading presently in Kenya?
Well, I coordinate the work of about 25 UN agencies. Each one of these agencies is doing a stellar job. And perhaps Kenya is one of the few countries in Africa where actually the head of state himself, President Kenyatta, oversees the United Nations Development Assistance Framework. There is a similar UNDP here, as we call it, in India. But in Kenya, this is a president and this is a government which takes very careful look at how the UN is doing its job, how the partnerships between the UN and the government is working, and how the UN is actually contributing to the government's own development plan. So I think Kenya is a great place to be working in, simply because the UN has the space to do it, and each one of the UN agencies, from UNICEF to WHO to UNDP to FAO, are doing stellar work, not only in terms of the development work and the human development work, but basically in a lot of the places where the economies need to be resurrected, you know, where the economy needs to be pump primed. Lot of work that is taking place. But Kenya, like India, has a huge opportunity. Both countries, actually, all of Africa is seeing a youth bulge. Large numbers of youth. And this is where you need to put them to work. Now, once they are starting to be, if you ensure that there is proper employment, everything starts to change. So I think now the full focus of both India and Kenya need to be on employment generation. And that is what is going to change the macroeconomic picture
of the whole thing. आपको कैसे लगता है ये problem solve हो सकता है? Because we have 80 million jobs short in India now.
Right. So look, I'm very hopeful. I just think the right legislations are needed.
The right skills.
The right partnerships are needed. The right skills are needed. I think for any country to take advantage of what I would term as the demographic dividend, and what is a demographic dividend? Is this huge youth bulge where they are put to work, where there are less women who are dependents and more women in the workforce, which means that the woman has been educated, allowed to gain her skills, and therefore she is able to plan her family.
And then
so there are four crucial E's.
Yes.
I'll call it. First, you need the education and skills for the woman and everybody and the young people. Second is empowerment. That is, women are freed up from the drudgeries of just being, in the household.
But they're doing 5 hours more in the house, Sidharth.
But also to be educated and allowed to be able to join the workforce. So she's empowered and enjoys equality. The third is employment. And what you need is like a post-Second World War Marshall Plan kind of thing in terms of employment generation. And the dignity in labor that needs to go with it. So whether it's a road builder or a plumber or a mason to a technology engineer, but we need to find those 80 million jobs, just as in Kenya. We need 1 million jobs a year for the next 15 years in order to ensure that young people are employed. And the fourth is equity. Equity is very important. And, when you have unequal growth, when there are certain places which are progressing and certain places that are progressing less, that is when you have the scourge of issues like violent extremism
and inequality.
Those are things that spur it. So I think all 4 E's need to be addressed collectively. And the moment is now. The next 5-6 years is what will launch the economy exponentially, both for Kenya and for India. That moment is now. So I just think politically, those and policy-wise and partnership-wise, this is the time to really steer it in that direction.
But you've been at close quarters in all these other places. You've seen war happening in Syria and a conflict long drawn and carrying on for so long. So do you also believe in the fact that very young and naive children are trained right from the beginning and into these militant and belligerent ways and end up becoming terrorists of sorts?
Well, that's the reality of it.
That is a tragedy.
So we just have to change that narrative altogether. So that is why conflict prevention becomes even more crucial. Then, when that is where the role of the UN, the international community comes into play, where we need to mediate conflicts and bring down the temperature before it starts to escalate. But then comes these, so therefore we should not be having children in militaries and armed forces. Children need to be in school and become productive people, So again, I would just re-emphasize that the issue of the opportunity both for India and Kenya is massive, and I think both countries can learn a lot from each other. I think Kenya, the kind of strides it's made on the issues of maternal and child health, the strides it's made on kind of poverty reduction, the strides it's made in terms of helping to transform its economy into a progressive one is massive. And I think these things will now need to come into play as we start to generate the employment which is needed. And I think both for India and Kenya, I think the time is now. This is the moment to take advantage of it.
And I love the lapel pin that you're wearing. That is United Nations and Kenya.
That's right. This is the lapel pin. I proudly wear it. This really is a reflection of the partnership that we have with the Kenyan government.
Tell us about your role as the resident coordinator. Firstly, many congratulations for being appointed, this pivotal appointment that you've got. So, and tell us a little more about Helen Clark.
Well, first of all, I have to take this opportunity to express my deepest gratitude to Helen Clark for having selected me for this job. Helen is an outstanding woman leader. I mean, we've seen the transformation that she has brought into the United Nations Development Program, but also as the chair of the United Nations Development Group. Helen is a passionate advocate of human rights. She's a passionate advocate for development. She's a passionate advocate of lifting people out of poverty. And that is how she steered the organization. She's probably one of the most social media savvy persons. And what she's always kept a spotlight is on this whole philosophy of leaving no one behind. In fact, when I took up this role, Helen's first message to me was, Sidharth, just make sure that there is no inequity. there is no one that is left behind. And that's the principle with which she drives the entire UN Development Program family on this entire principles. For me personally, it's a privilege serving a leader like Helen Clark.
Coming to your personal life now, we'd like to tell our viewers that you are the son-in-law of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon. So, कैसा लगता है आपको, उनके साथ associate करके? I'm sure you've really been inspired by the wonderful work that he has done for the entire world.
I knew the Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, my father-in-law, before he became the Secretary General, and he's a tireless worker. I mean, a person who himself calls himself a feminist, perhaps the first UN Secretary General to call himself that, and has really done a lot towards advancing the issues of women's rights, the issues of the girl child, the issues of he for she, really advocating for peace. And he, at a personal level, he's perhaps one of the most beautiful people I've ever met in my life. And this is not because he's my father-in-law. I just think that he's a man who really has a deep sense of justice, a deep sense of humanity.
And commitment.
And commitment, given the fact that he himself comes from incredible poverty. He's a product of the Korean War, where he had to trudge 8 to 10 kilometers to school, go hungry, and at a very young age had to look after over 9 siblings of his own. So, he's seen real poverty, and he's really come out from there, which is the story of South Korea, which is, it really came out from the ashes of tragedy into a phoenix of hope. I think South Korea is a fabulous example of what it's reached, and a lot of its people, have exactly achieved that. Today, I mean, from Samsung to everything else, South Korea is virtually everywhere a tiny nation, with very little natural resources, with just very little of everything, but focused on human development. And that goes back to the issue that we are talking about India and everywhere else. If we can focus on our human development, if we can focus on uplifting our women, if we can make sure that, there's a good old saying, which I think South Korea embraced: educate a man, you've educated an individual. Educate a woman, you've educated a family, a community, and a nation. So I think South Korea, that's what launched its economy, and that's exactly what we need to do. So Mr. Ban is a product of that. So to me, I mean, I'm privileged to have been to have served in the UN when he was the Secretary General, and he's also the grandfather of my 5-year-old son Jay, and he's a I wish him very, very well as he starts moving. He's winding down. He finishes on the 31st of December. But he is someone who, I can tell you one thing, even till date, every Saturday he actually has a French teacher who comes and gives him tuitions in French so that he keeps improving the French language.
Yes.
And he's got this very Confucius sense of justice about him. And that's why, of calm allurement. And I just feel that he is someone who is really dedicated himself to advancing the cause of humanity in every sense of the word, and I've seen it at a very personal level.
Finally, I'd like to ask you about your tenure in the Indian Army. आप 10 para commando regiment से हैं, तो आप NDA से हैं, IMA से हैं, तो कोई ऐसी मैसेज जो आप शेयर करना चाहेंगे अपने साथियों के साथ, अपने fellow Indian soldiers के साथ, कुछ कहना चाहेंगे आप?
There are 2 institutions that I hold very dear to me: the National Defense Academy, where I got my foundation, and everything I am today is the foundation there. And the second one is the 10th Para Commando, the regiment that I served. It was created by Maharaja of Bhavani Singh, and everything that I have become as a man, as an individual, in terms of my sensitivities, in terms of reorienting me towards being able to deal with any possible challenge in the world, comes from that battalion. So I owe it big time. And it was these institutions that prepared me for everything that I subsequently achieved after I left the army, including going back to school again. I went and educated myself at Princeton University.
Princeton, yes.
And Princeton was
you
another...
did international affairs there.
I did a master's in public policy at Princeton University. And another fantastic school. I mean, they had no reason to select me. There was nothing, I didn't have the kind of grades and testimonials to go with me, but they just picked me for my experiences. And another school that I'm deeply, deeply grateful to for having given me that chance to go there and do this one-year program, because I must say, Nidhi, and I would encourage every young person who's done about 10 to 15 years of work experience should look at a master's, at a mid-career master's, because it rewires you. You know, it really prepares you for the next phase of your life. And I'm a serious advocate for that, and I'm really proud to be call myself a Princeton alum, because that school, it really, then you start going, and there are doors that you don't necessarily have to knock on, and they open for you once you go through you know, the Ivy League school system. But having said that, I think any school is as good as that, but I just think we just have to make that extra effort in our career.
Walk that extra mile.
Walk that extra mile to just go back to academia, because it's probably one of the best decisions I took in my life, and this was when I was at a high point of my own UN career.
And on that wonderful note, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we wish you success in all your endeavors and many more partnerships ahead, many more successes ahead. Thank you once again, and we'd like to wrap up this edition of Aaj Savera.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you for having me on the show.